It was the third time that week her car sat arrogantly in my driveway, as if my existence didn't mean a thing. I stood by the kitchen window gripping my morning coffee with both hands. The ceramic mug had belonged to my mother, white porcelain with tiny blue roses painted around the rim. I'd held it through 1,000 mornings, but today it felt different, heavier, like it carried the weight of every silent humiliation I'd swallowed over the past 2 years. The silver car gleamed in my driveway, like a monument to disrespect, parked crooked, blocking my garage door, crushing the edge of my flower bed, where I'd planted those white petunias just last spring. The same petunias I'd watered every evening while she and my son Daniel laughed inside the house that used to feel like mine. I remember the day she first walked through my front door. Tall blonde, polished in that artificial way that screams expense. She had opinions about everything. My furniture was quaint, my cooking was traditional, and my Saturday morning routine of tending to my garden was sweet in an old-fashioned way. But it was the way she looked at me that cut deepest, like I was wallpaper, something decorative that had outlived its purpose. Daniel had been my whole world for 32 years. After his father abandoned us when Daniel was barely walking, I became everything. Mother, father, provider, protector. I worked double shifts at the textile factory, my fingers raw from handling industrial thread, my back aching from leaning over sewing machines for 12 hours straight. Every overtime dollar went toward his college fund. Every sacrifice was made with a smile, because that's what love looked like to me then. I never remarried, never dated seriously. Men would ask me out occasionally. Sweet widowers from church, divorced neighbors who brought me casseroles. But Daniel was my priority. Always Daniel. I told myself I'd have time for romance later, after he was established, after he was happy. Later never came. When he graduated with honors, I cried in the auditorium seats. When he got his first job in marketing, I framed his business card. When he moved back home to save money for a house, I turned the guest room into his office, without him even asking. I thought we were building something together. A foundation of mutual respect and love that would last forever. Then she appeared. At first, she was charming. She complimented my pot roast, asked about my garden, even brought me a scented candle for my birthday. But slowly, like water eroding stone, she began reshaping the landscape of my own home. She'd rearrange my spice rack to make it more functional. She'd suggest I upgrade my vintage kitchen appliances. She'd giggle and tell Daniel how adorable it was that I still used cloth napkins instead of paper ones. The changes started small. Daniel began eating dinner in his room instead of at the table with me. Our Sunday morning coffee ritual, where we'd sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing, disappeared. He stopped asking about my arthritis, stopped noticing when I was having bad days. She became his weather and I became background noise. But I adapted. I always had. I learned to make conversation around her, to include her in traditions that had been ours alone. When she criticized my holiday decorations, I let her redecorate. When she suggested I was doing too much by cooking elaborate Sunday dinners, I simplified my menus. I bent and bent until I nearly broke, telling myself this was what loving mothers do. They make space for their children's happiness, even when that space used to be filled with their own. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever sat at your own dinner table and felt like a guest who's overstayed their welcome? Then came the parking. The first time I assumed it was an accident. She'd parked behind my car, blocking me in, but when I knocked on her window, she waved dismissively and said she'd just be a minute. 45 minutes later, I missed my physical therapy appointment. The second time, she parked directly in front of my garage door. When I asked her to move, she sighed dramatically and said, "Can't you just park on the street for once?" My street, my driveway, my home. But the third time broke something fundamental inside me. I had a doctor's appointment, a follow-up for the irregular heartbeat that had been worrying my physician. I opened my garage door to find her car there again, this time with a note on my windshield. Borrowed your spot. Back later, XOXO. I stood in my garage holding that note and felt something shift. Not anger. That would come later. It was recognition. I recognized the feeling of being erased, of having my needs treated as inconvenient afterthoughts. I'd felt it with my ex-husband, who left me for a younger woman when the responsibility of fatherhood became too real. I'd felt it at the factory, where younger workers got promoted while I stayed in the same position for 15 years. I'd felt it in grocery store lines where cashiers looked through me at family gatherings, where distant relatives forgot my name. But I'd never expected to feel it in my own home, from my own son. That evening I made Daniel's favorite dinner, chicken parmesan with roasted vegetables. I set the table for 3 lit. The good candles even wore the blue blouse he'd complimented years ago. During dessert, I mentioned the parking situation. "Sweetheart," I said carefully. "I wonder if Sarah could park on the street when she visits. I had trouble getting to my appointment today." Daniel barely looked up from his phone. "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's not that big a deal." Sarah laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "Maybe we should look into senior living communities," she said sweetly. "Somewhere you wouldn't have to worry about parking or maintenance or any of those stressful things." The silence that followed felt infinite. I waited for Daniel to defend me, to recognize the insult, to remember that this was his mother sitting across from him. Instead, he nodded slowly. "That's not a bad idea," he said. "You're getting older, Mom. Maybe it's time to consider downsizing. Downsizing. As if my life, my home, my entire existence needed to be compressed to make room for someone else's comfort." I finished my dessert in silence. I cleared the dishes while they discussed vacation plans for Christmas. A trip to her parents' house in Colorado. They didn't invite me. They didn't even mention how I'd spend the holiday alone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to them laugh in the room next door. I thought about all the Christmases I'd made magical for Daniel. The year I worked overtime for 3 months to buy him the computer he wanted, the year I drove through a snowstorm to find the last copy of his favorite video game. I thought about the birthday parties I'd organized, the school projects I'd helped with, the heartbreaks I'd soothed, the dreams I'd funded with my factory wages and weekend cleaning jobs. I thought about the woman I used to be before I became just Daniel's mom. I'd been Margaret first. Margaret who loved mystery novels and gardening, who dreamed of traveling to Ireland someday, who wrote in a journal every night until exhaustion claimed her. Margaret who had opinions and preferences and a laugh that could fill a room. When had I stopped being Margaret and started being just convenient? The parking continued, every few days, sometimes daily, always blocking me in, always with that casual assumption that my schedule mattered less than hers. I started taking pictures, not to build a legal case, but to prove to myself that this was really happening, that I wasn't overreacting or imagining the deliberate nature of her actions. I researched senior communities online, wondering if they were right. Maybe I was too old, too set in my ways, too much trouble. The websites showed smiling elderly people playing cards and doing watercolor paintings. They looked diminished, content to be managed rather than living. But something else was growing inside me during those long, lonely weeks. It started as a whisper, then became a voice, then became a roar I could no longer ignore. It was the voice of the woman who'd raised a child alone, who'd worked 2 jobs while earning her night school degree, who'd rebuilt her life from scratch after her husband's abandonment. It was Margaret's voice, and she was furious. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. I'd scheduled a mammogram, one of those necessary but anxiety-inducing appointments that require mental preparation and careful timing. I'd arranged my day. Around it, even bought a new magazine to read in the waiting room. When I opened my garage door, there was the silver car. Again. This time she was in it. Engine running, phone pressed to her ear, laughing at something someone else had said. She saw me in the rearview mirror and held up one finger. The universal signal for wait. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. I knocked on her window. She rolled it down an inch. "I have a medical appointment," I said. "Almost done," she replied, not looking at me. 20 minutes passed. I called the doctor's office to reschedule, explaining I was blocked in my own driveway. The receptionist was kind but firm. The next available appointment was 3 weeks away. When Sarah finally moved her car, she didn't apologize. She didn't even look at me. She just drove away, leaving me standing in my garage, holding a rescheduled appointment card, and feeling something crystallize inside my chest. That evening, I called the towing company. "Is this your property?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," I said. "It's been my property for 18 years. And the vehicle is illegally parked." I looked at the photos on my phone. Dozens of them now documenting months of casual disrespect. "Yes," I said. "It is." The tow truck arrived at 6 a.m. the next morning just as I was watering my petunias. Sarah's car was in its usual spot blocking my garage. The driver was efficient professional. He hooked up the car like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The sound of metal scraping concrete woke the whole neighborhood. Sarah came running out in her robe, screaming. Daniel was behind her, confused and still half asleep. I stood on my porch in my gardening clothes coffee mug in hand, watching the car disappear down the street. "How could you do this?" Sarah shrieked. "That's my car." "Parked illegally on my property," I said calmly. "You can pick it up at the impound lot." Daniel stared at me like he'd never seen me before. "Mom, this is crazy. Why didn't you just ask her to move?" I almost laughed. I did ask. Many times. For months. But calling a tow truck, that's so aggressive. Aggressive. As if defending my own property rights was somehow inappropriate for someone my age. As if I should continue accepting disrespect with a smile, because that's what polite elderly women do. "Your father used to park in other people's spaces too," I said quietly. "He thought rules didn't apply to him, that other people's needs didn't matter as much as his convenience." The comparison hit its mark. Daniel's face changed, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to defend me against his father's casual cruelties. But Sarah wasn't finished. "You bitter old woman," she snarled. "No wonder your husband left you. No wonder you're all alone." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire. Neighbors had come out to watch. Mrs. Chen from next door who'd brought me soup when I had the flu. The Rodriguez family, whose kids I'd watched grow up from my front porch. They all heard it. The summary of my worth according to someone young enough to be my daughter. Daniel didn't defend me. He put his arm around Sarah's shoulders and whispered something in her ear. Then he looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "We'll get the car back," he said, "and then we need to talk." But I was done talking, done explaining, done justifying my right to exist in my own space. "Yes," I said, "we do need to talk." That afternoon, while they dealt with the impound lot, I called my attorney. Not to press charges or escalate the situation, but to make some long overdue decisions about my future. I'd been putting off estate planning, assuming I had years to figure it out. But watching my son choose someone else's comfort over my dignity clarified my priorities remarkably. I also called my old friend Ruth, who'd moved to a retirement community in Florida 2 years earlier. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Wanted the freedom from home. Maintenance. Wanted the social opportunities, wanted to wake up each day without worrying about anyone but herself. "It's not giving up," she'd told me when she first moved. "It's choosing what comes next instead of letting it choose you." At the time, I'd thought she was running away. Now I wondered if she'd been running towards something instead. When Daniel and Sarah returned that evening, I had documents spread across my dining room table. Insurance papers, deed information, financial statements, the accumulated proof of a life built one careful decision at a time. "Mom, we need to discuss boundaries," Daniel began, but I held up my hand. "Yes, we do," I said. "Let me start." I told them about the phone calls I'd made, the retirement community I'd be visiting next week, the house that would need to be sold or rented, the furniture that would need to be distributed or donated, the life that would be simplified, streamlined, reorganized around my needs instead of everyone else's. Sarah looked pleased. Daniel looked stricken. "But Mom, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," I said. "Not because I'm too old or too much trouble, but because I deserve to live somewhere I'm wanted, somewhere my needs matter, somewhere I don't have to fight for basic respect." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Well, I think it's for the best," she said. "You'll be happier with people your own age." Daniel shot her a look but didn't disagree. And in that moment, I felt the last thread of obligation snap. Not love. I would always love my son. But obligation. The weight of needing his approval, fearing his disappointment, accepting less than I deserved, because I was afraid of losing him completely. I'd already lost him. I just hadn't been ready to admit it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of difficult decisions and practical arrangements. I toured 3 retirement communities, each offering different amenities, different philosophies, different visions of what the next chapter might look like. The one I chose surprised everyone, including myself. It wasn't the closest to Daniel or the most luxurious or the most affordable. It was the one where I met Eleanor, an 82-year-old former librarian who was leading a book club discussion about mystery novels when I visited. It was the one where residents had their own small gardens behind their apartments. It was the one where the activities director asked about my interests, instead of just showing me the scheduled entertainment. It was the one where I felt like Margaret again, instead of just someone's inconvenient mother. The hardest part wasn't leaving the house. It was sorting through decades of accumulated memories. Every photo, every keepsake, every piece of furniture told the story of choices made with love and hope. I found Daniel's baby teeth in a small jewelry box, his first-grade art projects pressed between the pages of old photo albums, thank you cards. He'd made me for Mother's Day when gratitude was still simple and genuine. I kept some things, donated others, and yes, I threw some away. Not because they weren't precious, but because I was learning the difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it. Daniel helped with the moving truck, but our conversations remained surface level. We talked about logistics and paperwork, but not about feelings or regrets, or the years of love that had somehow curdled into resentment. Sarah stayed away, which was probably best for everyone. On my last night in the house, I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea looking at the driveway that had become a battlefield. The petunias I'd replanted were thriving white blooms, glowing in the twilight like small victories. I thought about all the mornings I'd watched Daniel leave for school from this same spot, All the evenings I'd waited for him to come home safe. I thought about the woman I'd been when I first bought this house. 38 years old recently, divorced, terrified but determined to build a stable life for my son. She'd been so strong, that woman, so sure that love and sacrifice would be enough, so convinced that giving everything meant she'd never be left with nothing. I wanted to tell her that she'd done her best, that the boy would grow up to disappoint her, but that wouldn't erase the value of her love, that she'd lose herself for a while but she'd find herself again, that it was never too late to choose dignity over convenience, self-respect over peacekeeping. I wanted to tell her that the end of one story could be the beginning of another. My new apartment is smaller but sunnier. My neighbors are women like me, women who've survived divorces and widowhood, raised children, and buried parents, worked and retired and wondered what comes next. We play cards on Tuesday afternoons and take turns cooking dinner for each other. We share books and garden, tips and occasionally carefully our stories. I've joined the mystery book club Eleanor leads. I've started taking a watercolor class, something I always wanted to try but never had time for. I'm learning to paint flowers, and my instructor says I have a natural eye for color and composition. Who knew Daniel calls once a week now? Our conversations are polite but distant. He tells me about work promotions and vacation plans. I tell him about book club and my watercolor progress. We don't mention Sarah or the towing incident or the years of accumulated resentments that led us here. Maybe someday we will. Maybe someday we'll find our way back to something that resembles the relationship we used to have. But I'm not waiting for that anymore. I'm not waiting for his approval or his understanding or his gratitude. I'm not waiting for him to see what I sacrificed or to appreciate what I gave. I'm not waiting for apologies that may never come, or recognition that might be too late. I'm living instead. Finally, fully unapologetically living. Yesterday I bought myself a new car. Nothing fancy. A reliable compact with good gas mileage and Bluetooth for the audiobooks I've become addicted to. But it's mine, chosen by me, paid for with money I saved, instead of spending on other people's dreams. And you know what the best part is? I can park it wherever I want. In my assigned space, at the retirement community, at the grocery store, at the doctor's office, at the bookstore, where I browse for hours without anyone telling me I'm taking too long. No one can block me in anymore. No one can trap me, or diminish me, or treat my needs as inconvenient afterthoughts. I've learned to value my own time, my own space, my own right to exist, without constantly justifying that existence to others. The other day, while I was painting watercolor roses in art class, Eleanor asked me if I ever regret the decision to move. "Do you miss your old life?" she said. I thought about it carefully before answering. I miss parts of it. The familiarity, the illusion of family closeness, the version of myself that still believed love could conquer any obstacle. But I don't miss feeling invisible. I don't miss swallowing my needs to keep peace. I don't miss the woman who'd become so small she could be overlooked even by her own son. I miss who I thought we were, I told Eleanor. But I don't miss who I had to become to maintain that illusion. She nodded. Eleanor understands. Most of the women here understand. We've all had to learn the difference between being needed and being valued, between being loved and being respected. Some lessons come early in life. Others take decades to learn. But it's never too late to choose yourself. It's never too late to remember that your needs matter. Your feelings are valid. Your presence is a gift rather than an obligation. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in my story, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever bent so far to accommodate others that you nearly broke, please know this: you deserve better. You deserve to be seen, heard, respected, and valued for who you are, not just what you provide. You deserve to park in your own driveway, literally and metaphorically. And if people in your life can't understand that basic truth, then maybe it's time to find people who can. Because the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. And that relationship deserves the same care, attention, and respect you've been giving to everyone else. It's never too late to come home to yourself. Trust me on this one. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories of courage and transformation. Give this video a like if it resonated with you. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. Someone who might need to hear that their worth isn't determined by how much they sacrifice for others. Together we can remind each other that it's never too late to choose dignity, respect, and self-love.